I am here today with Marcus Walton. This is Bull City's podcast, Sex and the Bull City.
Got it. Nailed
I got it this
it.
time.
Nailed
All right. I am Celynd Malone, the newest associate at Bull City Psychotherapy. I've been here for about a year. I did my internship here, um, taking new clients, just to be aware. And this is Marcus. We met earlier this week and recorded about purity culture, and we're here to talk a little bit more of it.
Yeah. And
Go ahead and remind us about a little bit about you.
well, I'm an intern here at Bull City, and taking clients, open to clients. It's pro bono or sliding scale, $10 to $30. Very cheap, very good. Yeah, come on in.
And you're going to be with us through August,
Yeah, that's right. I'm
July,
gonna
August.
be here as an intern through August, and then I'll graduate and be licensed and see where I go from there. I might stay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, so we introduced the concept last time of purity culture, how it relates to evangelical Christianity, the kind of the background and the roots that you and I share.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we were thinking about the follow-up that we wanted to do to that, gender roles came up for us as just a thing that we could explore a little bit more. Everything from the male gaze is a topic we want to address, and the impacts on both genders, and other effects that having these strict expectations around the performance of what's in your pants
Well said.
comes out.
Well said. Yeah, there's a lot of harm that can come from a rigidity of those roles.
Right. But that's the expectation frequently.
Mhm.
And so that's why we're talking about it today. You may have experienced this if you share a similar background to what we have. Or this might be brand new to you and just an interesting topic. So one of the things that we were just talking about, and I wanted to kind of explore more with you, the male gaze. Tell me what that means to you, and I'll tell you what it means to me.
Yeah, I think to me it is the uh, objectification of women. That is um, sort of the male gaze, right? The image there is the act of looking, and the act of looking and staring, and in a way that I think frames the relationship as when we say objectification, like subject object. So there's I am the male, I am the one with subjectivity, agency, power in the situation, right? And you are the female sort of receives, right? And yeah, this in a concrete way, and then we'll get to what your definition or idea there. But I was just telling her about remembering that I was involved in a Bible study at one point when I was in youth group, and we were following a book called Every Young Man's Battle, which was very exciting because you could regard not masturbating as like being Russell Crowe in The Gladiator or something.
An abs metaphor?
A
I'm
fight
not
to
sure
the
about that.
death. And uh, but I remember something from that, which wasn't all bad. I think practically speaking, and I think it's an interesting case of I don't know, not a bad practice that comes from I think a really weird sort of theory and framework of sexuality. But there was something in the book about bouncing the eyes, and which is really kind of you know taking seriously the male gaze in a certain way, and saying like it's your responsibility as a man to control your sexuality and not impinge upon the freedom and comfort level of women around you, right? And so not to objectify them with your gaze. When you catch yourself staring, bounce your eyes. So, anyways, a touch point there. So what
So
comes up for you?
as you're talking about that, I'm feeling both supportive and critical of that.
Yeah, yeah.
In that, supportive in that staring at women is probably a bad idea. Um, but there's also the sense in which the male gaze, from a female perspective, is a wider concept.
Mm.
That it's not just looking at women
Mm.
or even just looking at them as objects. The not looking is also a form of objectification in that you're still the one in the observer role. You're choosing to look, choosing not to look. And I'm not sure that this translates to practical advice in terms of we'll just keep staring. Not what I'm saying.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that aspect of that, bouncing the eyes, if you catch yourself um, staring, I think that's probably wise. And going deeper than that is where I want to take this conversation, because the deeper part of that is consider your role as the observer. That you're not just trying to not look, you are actively viewing that as a person. There is care and empathy and humanizing, and not just seeing the body in any sphere, right? This brings up an interesting point for me. Is there a place for objectification in our sexual lives? Can we appreciate the form of someone that we find attractive?
Right.
And in what ways can that be healthy? In what ways can that be harmful?
Right.
And I think the word just is going to come into play, because I think if you see somebody as just a body, you are dehumanizing. You're taking away their agency. Right. If you see somebody as a whole human, and then at the same time you are appreciating their form, that's part of who they are. And that might sound like semantics, but being on the other end of it feels very different.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm thinking here something that we were talking earlier about, which I think can kind of come in here and map onto this well and give it a little structure, is that so a piece of background for religious fundamentalism, is that it's one of the things that really defines it and gives it its sense of structure, a rather rigid structure, is sort of clearly codified morality, which is sort of rules of do's and don'ts. And so we get this practical piece of advice, right, about bouncing your eyes, and it becomes another rule to sort of structure behavior. And it's like the other thing that I feel like you're proposing here feels more like what we would call ethics, which is that the work of figuring out what is right and wrong in a situation is dynamic and contextual, right?
And it's context of a relationship.
Yeah.
Objectification, viewing someone as a sexual, physical being, might be appropriate,
right,
in that context.
And in a way, purity culture does that. It says when outside of the context of a married relationship, right, no kind of sexual objectification is permissible. And so I do think
I agree with that.
Right, there's you're sort of kicking the can down the road further and further of like marriage. Like marriage will be the thing that is the great moment of permission, wherein as we were kind of talking last episode about just like all your wildest sexual dreams will come true once you're married. Um, and so yeah, but even there, it lacks. Um, there's kind of like morals that run all the way up to marriage,
Mm-hmm.
and then it's interesting. There's almost a like implied free for all in a certain way.
As long as
It's
it
just
remains within the bounds of that marriage.
right.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of how sex actually works, which is a constant kind of checking in with a certain kind of ethical reasoning,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Say
And
more about that.
well, for instance, um, like consent is like
Mm-hmm.
always a thing to be considered. Whereas I think probably within a fundamentalist evangelical kind of purity culture understanding, it's like once you're married, um, it's all the sex that you want, kind of,
Mm-hmm.
right? And but there's a kind of um, sex is sort of implicitly owed then
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of times, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like it's something that both partners owe to one another as a duty of marriage. And so I guess there is that moral structure like continues, right?
Mm-hmm.
You owe your partner sex as a part of being married. That's part of the
Mm-hmm.
contract, you know. And so a contractual structure is a little more like a moral structure
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to ethics, which are again, I feel like there's that sense of every day and every moment is new, and like you you learn what your partner likes, you learn what your partner's into, you learn yourself, and yet I think there's something beautiful about like some sense of also starting with a blank slate with that ethical reasoning. Just like, I don't know, what are you into today?
Mm-hmm.
What are you comfortable with in this moment?
I think of a conversation we had recently about consent and how it's not just a checkbox
Mm-hmm.
in at the beginning of a process to make sure you don't get in any legal trouble,
Right,
right?
right.
Like it's not legality of sex is should not be the ceiling. That's really the floor.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes, for
that
sure.
in therapy we have this concept of informed consent,
Mm,
and that means that as the relationship continues, from the time a client first walks in the door to the very last session they ever have with you, you're in this ongoing process of explaining what to expect, what your limits are, what the boundaries are, and letting people make decisions for themselves based on
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
those parameters.
Yeah.
And bringing the concept of informed consent into sexuality,
Mm-hmm,
I think takes it to that deeper ethical level that you're describing. That it's about the overall uh, where you are
mm-hmm,
with someone or someone's in in relationship, and it's not just they said yes and so we're good,
right.
or they married me and
Oh,
so now everything I want
right.
belongs to me. Um,
Right.
and we to come back to our um, conversation around gender roles.
Mm-hmm,
I mentioned in our last podcast that one of the frequent outcomes, whether it's intended or not, one of the frequent outcomes of purity culture is this sense of gatekeeping by women,
mm-hmm,
that women are set up to be the ones who say no,
mm-hmm, right.
and they are expected to uh, be less sexual, not
Mm-hmm,
want sex, be more pure.
mm-hmm.
Um,
That's right.
that's why we call it purity culture, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
At least that was my experience of purity culture.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that men could be forgiven their sexual indiscretions.
Right.
But women, the illustration was um, they're like a rose
Yeah.
or a flower, and when they have sex, the petals fall right off. And then, do you really want to give that to someone that you love? Those petals have fallen off, and we stomp on them on the floor.
Yeah, it's rough.
Somehow this
It's rough.
has changed something fundamental about them and made them less.
Yeah.
And if you have made yourself less for your partner, um, you've done a disservice to everybody. And that was my experience of purity culture. Um, that women are put into that role, and men are put into the role of pursuers, the ones who are pushing for sex, the ones who are hoping and expecting and pressuring. And go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, or again, when I think the men do look like courteous and respectful, they're put in, and maybe this goes back to what you're saying about they're still the subject, they're still the one who's sort of in control. Yeah, like, or they're not, they, and this can be kind of fluid, them going back and forth between these roles, like either the pursuer, right, or um, they can be kind of the protector of the fragile, sort of feminine, like you said, like this flower, and again, that sounds better on one level, as opposed to kind of predator and prey,
Right.
which is the pursuer is that kind of model. Um, but I don't know, somehow it's playing out the same dynamics in a different register.
Was that your experience? I know you said for you were all in on purity culture and on remaining pure, and was that your experience, that you felt this need or this pressure to protect
Yes.
the
I was.
purity of
Oh yes.
yourself and your partner?
Yes, I was a very good boy, and I did what I was supposed to do, and so yeah, I had a serious high school girlfriend for years, and we were very, very protective of our purity, and yeah, it's a thing I look back on, and I don't know, it's still somewhat mysterious to me. I had a lot of desire. I was a teenage boy, you know. Um, yeah.
So, I like where you took that in terms of this being that same kind of objectification, that the woman's purity is the object.
Yeah.
And it must be protected, regardless of which role you're choosing in that. Whether you're choosing to protect it, you're choosing to pursue it.
Right.
She remains the object, the thing that is being pursued, the thing that is being protected. And she's a thing.
That's right. And also, it's like playing it out along the timeline, along this certain narrative arc, right? That's headed towards marriage. It's like is like what is it that makes, I'm just spitballing here. I'm curious about this. What is it that makes the marriage bed undefiled, so to speak, right? If having sex is to somehow break this fragile thing, this fragile object, or to make impure what was pure, it definitely trades on a certain kind of magical thinking that I think our actual feelings and reasoning doesn't really square with, which is to say, if sex is dirty before, what is the magic that makes it not dirty after? And that is a long shadow and a cost of purity culture, is that people get to be adults and they're like, they can even get married and they can be like, why do I still feel dirty and bad about having sex now that we did the magic thing, we got married? It should just be, I should just feel great now, but I still feel weird and guilty. It's it's a thing.
Absolutely.
It's totally a thing.
Totally something happens. I've had clients talk to me about this ongoing view of themselves as being less than now that they are sexually active.
Yeah.
While at the same time, um, at least among female clients, feeling this pressure that they ought to be more sexual, they ought to be more wild and carefree and experimental and knowing where to take that, how to go from no sexuality to this wild abandon.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
It's just not how it works.
Well, so talk to me about that as like I don't know, almost and this isn't a withering criticism by any means. I think we've kind of gone back and forth on like the virtues of a lot of the basic assumptions of a sex positive framework. And I kind of joked that, I think I'm sex neutral. It can be good and bad. And, but like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm hearing there that there's some kind of cultural pressure to, you said like be wild and kind of like go out there, like treat yourself, girl, like that kind of thing. That seems like I generally speaking a product of sex positive culture. And so like I think you rightly are like, I'm a defender of sex positivity. I think it's a really good force in the world. So, what's happening there? Why is it how is it acting as this force that's kind of I don't know, not somehow not supporting or honoring someone's journey, there.
I think it's going to come back to objectification.
Okay.
I am pro any sex that's not objectifying. Any sex that allows people to treat each other as human and respect the the complexities of that before, during, and after um, can be a good thing.
Yeah.
And partly it's a backlash to my upbringing. That that there's
it's good to have awareness of
right.
That,
yeah, I'm very aware that this is a backlash, and I would also say I'm kind of a sex geek in that I love the academics of it. I am getting my PhD in clinical sexology. I like to think about it, and that's because to me, this is one of the most human endeavors. It involves our politics. They come in the bedroom all the time.
Oh, yeah.
It involves our religion. That's what we've been talking about. It involves our education. It involves our relationships at the deepest level. It's our fears about being vulnerable and, bringing those things into a safe space. I'm just fascinated by that. And I have to view sex as powerful, but yet positive.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've had interesting conversations around that of like, how do we relate to things that are really powerful in a way that um, doesn't get reactive and fearful. And I think that's a lot of what characterizes purity culture is being really afraid of the power of sex. Um, and in some ways, um, I think somehow also really and knowingly irresponsibly wielding power over sex.
Yeah.
So I kind of want to I feel like I've given a lot of evidence, so to speak, of the like, there are some good intentions in purity culture, but I think there are these deep roots in purity culture that are related to patriarchy,
And control.
and control,
Mm-hmm.
control of women's bodies,
Mm-hmm.
and you talk about
Ownership.
yeah, I was gonna say you talk about objectification. I was thinking about how like so much of the structure of moral thinking is contractual,
Mm-hmm.
and contracts are about property,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and for a very, very long time, marriage was primarily about property,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
And that's, the one of the ideas that I came away from purity culture with, that my sexuality didn't belong to me, it belonged to my future husband, and that
Yeah.
if I were to give it away,
Mm-hmm.
I'm giving away his property.
Yeah.
And that's problematic.
Totally.
And while I'm sure some people have had the positive intentions that you are describing, there are people that really just like to be in charge.
Mm-hmm.
That makes them feel safe in this world. That
Yeah.
makes them feel important.
Mm-hmm.
And they think that their way is the way.
Yeah. And I think there are complex systems of self-deception that are sometimes at play where
100%.
people, again, it's like we don't have that many odious villains in the world who are like rubbing their hands together as they're hatching evil plots before they go to bed at night. Um, People think that they are following and helping to support a moral order
Mm-hmm.
that is for the good of all when
For sure.
investing in systems that are really destructive and oppressive.
What I have noticed about human nature is that there is a tendency to notice when your power is draining, or
Mm-hmm.
when people are proposing things that might make you slightly less in charge.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Um, I've experienced this within a religious context, that um, any kind of dissent,
Mm-hmm.
any kind of disagreement is met with this panic.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that comes from feeling threatened. Now, I would say very few people can identify that that's what's happening. They, like you said, they're not rubbing their hands together at night and thinking, oh, here's how I'm going to control Celynd.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I I doubt anybody thinks that closely about me, period. But when there is a situation that they feel they need to be in charge, and they have been duly placed there by God,
Mm-hmm.
especially,
Yeah.
um, there's a certain authority that they feel that they bring to that situation, that they have a right to insert themselves into the sex lives of others.
Mm-hmm.
Which,
Yeah.
in any other situation, if it were not a religious moral failing to be sexually active before marriage,
Mm-hmm.
would be really creepy. If somebody was really, really interested in your sex life, or the sex life of your teenagers,
Mm-hmm.
and really inserted themselves into their sexual decisions, and,
Mm-hmm.
in any context, that would be problematic, I hope. And yet, in purity culture, it's routine.
Yeah.
And justified.
Yeah.
And that's about control.
Mm-hmm.
It's justified because God told me.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So for me, sex positivity is a way of reclaiming a very human I qualify it in that sex that objectifies
Mm-hmm.
is likely not ethical. And I'm not talking about the kink there,
Yeah.
because I want to acknowledge
Mm-hmm.
this is a kink
Right.
that can be engaged in safely.
Right.
And we can talk a little about that in probably another episode because we're running low on time today.
Yeah.
But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about treating another person with care
Mm-hmm.
and respect
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
autonomy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And within that context, that's a qualified
Mm-hmm.
sex positivity. But within that context, I am all in.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many benefits to, at the very least, being able to make your own decisions around sex and not doing it because of coercion either direction.
Yeah.
Not being coerced into having it and not being coerced into not having it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Being able to make decisions that are right for you based on education. This is why public education, and I'm going to take a stand here, public education needs to be talking about these things. Um, all education needs to be talking about these things because it's part of our humanity. And this is why I think we are kind of in the place that we're at with people wrestling with their value as sexual selves.
I think I imagine there's a lot of resistance among, um, let's say, fundamentalist, religiously minded people with sex positivity because they're not wanting to cede that ground to authorities they don't trust. And, I think it was interesting. I don't know. I was thinking, well, if sex positive, or if purity culture is kind of implicitly in the way that we framed it, sort of a moral order, a fairly rigid moral order about sexuality that says sex is bad unless, and then there's kind of a list. I'm sure that some people experience sex positivity as a kind of alternative moral order. It's like sex is good unless, and but I think so much of what we've talked about here is, um, as we kind of said, sexual ethics, which is like maybe it's not bad to have like some certain ground rules or ideas. Like consent is kind of like, in some ways it's like we want to have these rules, and then it gets on the legal arena, which is like all about really clearly codified rules, um, which is how we choose to organize our public life, through enforcing and interpreting those. But on the ground, trying to be good people and trying to take care of communities, it really does feel like we need a some kind of a broad and inclusive sexual ethics. And the trouble is, how do you make that inclusive for as many people as possible? Yeah.
Humanize.
Yeah.
Treat the other person as a person first. And their
right.
their sexuality can be an aspect of that. This is probably not super sex positive in that I'm not really advocating for hookup culture, because it's so easy to not treat another person with respect when you don't know them.
And that's where, again, it's, second wave, second wave feminism, the sexual revolution. There's sort of this, again, the pendulum swing. We're always recovering from whatever the last pendulum swing was, right? And like trying to think the world right, and permissivity, sort of reign, and of course it had with it all these like gifts, and then all these costs. and like we're always trying to get centered, right, from whatever the last pendulum swing was.
I've read some things recently that really challenged the idea of consent being the rule. Um, as I said before, that it's the floor, not the ceiling. Um,
Yeah.
that it's the bare minimum, and that the book I was reading, it's called Rethinking Sex, and the ethic that the author, brings forward is this idea of treating other people with humanity first. And that's something I can really get behind.
Yeah, totally.
Anything that dehumanizes someone else runs the risk of harm. Can you have mutual casual sex? Yeah. Is there a higher risk that somebody will be harmed in that? Yeah. And that's where I think we need to be paying attention. I am not one to judge. And connection. This sense of relationship and community can only be built on that sense of respect and humanity.
I like that. Yeah, it strikes me when you're talking about risks. It's like we have to be realists about some of the risks that are involved. And I think, again, that's one of the things that fundamentalist structures try to do via their rigid moral orders is essentially eliminate risk, to get rid of it entirely. And
does not happen.
No, it does. Well, it doesn't happen. So you end up just invisibilizing risks that are real and then unacknowledged and then totally unmanageable. And then, but that, in our ethical decision making, we are choosing to manage and mitigate risk, and
decide for yourself what risk you want to engage
in. Yeah, exactly. And have a realistic idea of what the costs may be, Yeah, exactly.
I think being able to be critical of risk and honest about it.
Yeah.
If you're mature enough to be mature enough to be considering what the risks are.
Yeah. But we're so, oh God, we're so tempted by these, illusions. Like something we were talking about the other day was, this idea of safe spaces, and how I had a friend one time say, just like, there's no such thing as safe spaces. There's only safer spaces. Meaning risks are something we're always having to account for, and but they're worth it in a lot of ways. They're worth it because, again, I think the fundamentalist sort of creation of an environment that is supposedly without risks, there's so much vitality that is sapped with that, and I think with power and energy and freedom, it's just like there's always going to be risks there. It's part of the package.
Yeah. And I think talking about risky sex is probably a whole other podcast.
Yeah. It probably is.
We can come back and talk about that.
Yeah. We covered some good ground today.
We did.
We didn't get too abstract. I like the rare airs up there, the ethers.
We came back down a couple of times.
Yeah, we were touching back down. Yeah.
So again, we're taking claims.
Hey.
If this is something that has resonated with you, if you have experience with purity culture and are concerned about its effects on you and your sex life, or you as a person, find us, bullcitypsychotherapy.com, and we both work with religious trauma. We both work with
LGBTQIA clients.
Yep.
You're going to get unconditional positive regard.
That's right.
Whatever you bring in.
That's right.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us today.